Erev Tov Rabotai, we are continuing with the Mishna Yomi Masechet Shabbat. We are up to Perek Yud Mishnah Daled. Today's Mishnayot should be Leilu Nishmat, Neria ben Svetlana, Aranbai, Eliyahu ben Burcha, Israel, ben Hana bat Zilpa, Menuchatam beGan Eden. Amen. The Mefarshim explain as an introduction to today's Mishnah, the Torah refers to the Melachot of Shabbat as calculated labor, Melechet Machshevet, from which we learn that a person is liable for performing a Melacha only if he intended to do it. Therefore, if a person intended to perform a permissible action and accidentally performed a melacha instead, he is exempt from liability. So for example, he picked up a vegetable from the ground thinking that it was already plucked, but in fact it was still attached to the ground, so he unwittingly committed the melacha of reaping. This exemption is called mitasek, one who commits an unwilling act. It literally means one who is busy, but it means he's busy with one matter and does something else unthinkingly, right? He didn't think about it. Now, the following Mishnah teaches that in certain cases, this exemption applies even if one did intend to do a melacha, but accidentally performed it in a way that's inferior to the one that he had planned. Let us see the Mishnah. If one intends to transfer an item suspended in front of him, but before he completes the transfer, it slides around and goes behind him, he is exempt from liability. And the Mefarshim explain carrying an article in front of one's body is better than carrying it behind one's back, because one can more easily guard and protect whatever is in front of him. Therefore, if one intends to carry something in front of him, but it shifts around to the back, the transfer is completed in a manner that is inferior to the one he planned, and therefore a person is exempt from such a melacha because it's not a calculated labor. However, in the opposite case, where one intends to transfer an item suspended behind him, so in this case, he's not so particular about providing the item with superior protection, but before he completes the transfer, it slides around and goes in front of him. He is liable. Since the resulting act is better than the one he had intended, he is liable. The Mefarshim explain, even though he ended up carrying the object in a way that he did not intend, he is still presumably happy with the result. That suffices for it to be halachically regarded as a melacha for which he did have intent, as Rashi explains in Masechet Shabbat, page 92b. And therefore, like we said, he is liable for it. Be'emet amru, the Mishnah now cites an exception. In truth, they said, which Mefarshim explained, this term is used to introduce a teaching that resembles a halacha leMoshe Sinai, and the fact that it's undisputed, as the Rav told us in his commentary to Mishnayot Masechet Trumot, chapter 2, Mishnah 1. But again, Be'emet amru, in truth, they said, Hayisha hachogeret b'sinar, if a woman wearing an underskirt, which is an item of clothing that was worn for purposes of modesty, if she transfers something that is attached to the skirt, ben milefanea uben milachareh hayevet, she is liable whether the item slides in front of her or behind her, sheken raui liot chozer, because a woman knows that it's normal for an underskirt to turn around when she walks and that any attached item will move with it. Now, since she knew that the item can move to the front or the back, it's as though she intended to carry it in either position. Therefore, even if it was originally in front of her and it moved to the back, she cannot be exempted from liability on the grounds that that was not her intent. She knew that that could have well happened. Now, the next Tana that we're going to quote extends the previous ruling to the king's mail carriers who would carry royal letters in tubes slung from their necks. Rabbi Yehuda says, Af mekablei fitkin. Even those who receive royal letters to deliver are liable for transferring, regardless of whether the tube slides in front or behind them. Again, the tube is where the letters are held. Now, like in the previous case, according to Rabbi Yehuda, a letter carrier knows that it's normal for his tube to move around when he runs. So since he realizes from the start, he is liable even if this tube slips behind him. Now, the Tana Kama, however, rules that unlike the woman who carried something attached to her underskirt, the courier is exempt if he put the tube in front of him and it shifted to the back, because this is not so likely to happen that we can view it as having been his intent from the start, whereas by the woman's underskirt, that is a very well possibility that it will likely happen. And this is how the Tosfot Yom Tov explains that Tana Kama would disagree with Rabbi Yehuda, and the Rav tells us, Ven halacha ki Rabbi Yehuda, the halacha does not follow Rabbi Yehuda. That is in Rabotai Mishnah Dal. Mishnah Hina continues, we learned that if one person did just the first part of the melacha and another person did the second half, both are exempt from liability, like we learned in chapter 1, Mishnah 1, and chapter 10, Mishnah 2. This Mishnah teaches the law regarding two people who perform an entire melachat together from beginning to end. Hamotzi chikar lereshut harabim hayav. One who transfers a loaf of bread from a private domain to a public domain is liable because he did the entire melacha himself, which this halakha is obvious. The Ritbaz says it was stated by the Mishnah to introduce the next ruling. Hotziu shnayim piturin. But if two people transferred it together, both are exempt because neither performed the entire melacha on his own. And the Mefarshim explain that the case is referring to where they did every part of the melacha together. Both of them picked up the object in the Rishut Yachid, carried it into the Rishut Harabim, and put it down. Now we learn from the Torah that when two people do a melacha together, both are exempt. In order to be liable, one person must do the entire melacha himself, as the Gemara tells us on page 92b in Masechet Shabbat. The Mishnah continues, Lo yachol echad lotzio. However, if one person cannot transfer it by himself, for example, because it's too heavy, v'otziu shnayim, and two people transferred it together, hayavim, they are both liable, because in this case, each is viewed as though he performed the entire melacha. Now the Mefarshim explained, the Tosfot, the Masechet Baba Kama, page 48, explains that each person must bring his own hatat offering. Now, the Mefarshim explained this case, if the only way to carry such an item is by sharing the task with someone else, it's normal for two people to do it together. And additionally, each person is fully liable because he is regarded as though he did the entire task on his own, since it could have not been accomplished without him, as the Rav explains a similar concept in chapter 13, Mishnah 6. Now, the Torah's exemption applies only when the melacha could have been done by one person alone, in which case it's unusual to have two people doing it. So if two people did it, they'd be exempt. The Rabbi Shimon Poter, but Rabbi Shimon exempts them here in this case as well, because the reality is that neither did the entire melacha, which the Mefarshim explained. Rabbi Shimon learns from the Torah that two people who perform a melacha together are always exempt, even if the melacha could not have been done except by both of them together, as the Gemara explains his opinion on page 93a in Masechet Shabbat. But the Rav tells us, Ven halachak Rabbi Shimon, the halacha does not follow Rabbi Shimon. The Mishnah now deals with the case of a single person who carries the item not by itself but in a container. If one transfers less than the minimum amount of food, meaning less than the minimum that renders one liable for transferring, which we said in the case of food is the volume of a dried fig, like we saw in chapter 7, Mishnah 4. So the Mishnah is referring to someone who carried less than that. If he carried less than that amount of food in a vessel, Patur afalakli, he is exempt not only for carrying the food, but even for carrying the vessel, shaklit felalo, because the vessel is secondary to the food. Since he's using the container only to hold the food, it has no independent significance. Now, had he transferred the container to use in another place, he would have incurred liability, as the Gemara says on page 93b in Masechet Shabbat. But in this situation, however, he is exempt because he did not transfer the container for its own sake, but only to hold the food he was carrying, and therefore the container is secondary to the food, as the Rambam says in Chut Shabbat, chapter 18, halakha 28. Likewise, if one transfers a live person on a bed, patur afalamita is exempt not only for carrying the person in view of the rule that a living person carries himself, chay noset atzmo, which we will explain, but he's even exempt from carrying the bed. Now the Mefarshim explain the concept of chay noset atzmo, a living creature carries itself, means that when a person is being carried, he naturally shifts his weight around to gain a degree of balance. Therefore, he carries himself to some extent and lightens the load on the person who is carrying him. Now, the carrier, therefore, is not liable because he's being assisted in a significant way by the person being carried. Now, this principle does not apply where the carried person is tied up and unable to move, as the Rav explained. Since he cannot carry himself by moving his weight around, he does not assist the carrier at all, and the carrier is liable. Here, it's where he can move around. Now, the Mishnah says, not only are you exempt on account of chay noset atzmo, but you are also exempt for carrying the bed. Shamitat felalo, because the bed is secondary to the person. Now the Mishnah continues, Et hamed b'mitah hayav. However, one who transfers a corpse on a bed is liable because a corpse does not carry itself. Now this halakha applies even if his purpose in transferring the corpse was the purely negative one of removing it from the house because it transmits tumah, and its new location is no interest to him. But despite his lack of positive, constructive intent, he is still liable. The same law applies when one removes any item from his house in order to be rid of it because it transmits tumah, including an olive's volume of a corpse, an olive's volume of a dead animal, and a lentil's volume of the carcass of one of the 8 species of creeping animals that transmit tumah when dead, which are listed in Sefer Vayikra, chapter 11, Psukim 29 and 30, and in the Mishnah, chapter 14, Mishnah 1. Now, the amounts named in the Mishnah, which we said an olive's volume of a dead person or animal, a lentil's volume of the carcass of one of the 8 creeping creatures, there the Rav says the minimum quantities of each item that can transmit tumah. Now, in any of these cases, Hayav, in all of these cases, he is liable, even though his purpose was negative. Now, the next Tana disagrees in regards to transferring an item only for the sake of removing it from its original place, the Rabbi Shimon poter, but Rabbi Shimon exempts one who transfers all or part of a dead person or animal from his house, because in his view, there is no liability for taking something out of one's house only to be rid of it. Since the melacha was done for a purely negative purpose, according to Rabbi Shimon, since the transfer was done for a purely negative purpose, it does not count as a melacha. And the Mefarshim explain that the basic purpose of transferring an item from one domain to another is that one wants it to be in the second domain. If the carrier has no interest in the object being in the second domain, and his intent is only to remove it from the first one, he has performed a melacha she'enat tzicha legufa, a melacha that is not needed for its defined purpose, which means that any melacha that is done, not for its positive purpose, but only to avoid an unwanted situation, that's not considered a melacha. Another example is trapping an animal only to prevent it from causing damage and not because one wants to have the animal. Now, according to Rabbi Shimon, such a melacha does not fall under the category of melechet machshevet, which we call in this case purposeful labor. So for this reason, Rabbi Shimon rules that one is not liable for transferring any of the items listed in the Mishnah, even an entire corpse, since he does so only to remove a source of tumah from his house. However, the Tana Kama holds the person is liable for doing a melacha not needed for its defined purpose, melacha she'enat tzicha legufa, because he maintains that any melacha done for a significant purpose, even a negative one, suffices to be called melechet machshevet, a purposeful labor. And the Mefarshim do bring down, the arts elucidated in the notes, bring down that Tosfot on page 94 identified the Tana Kama as Rabbi Yehuda. And the Rav tells us, Ven halacha Rabbi Shimon, the Rav says the halacha does not follow Rabbi Shimon. And that is in Rabotai today's Mishna Yomi. Baruch Adonai Leolam. Amen v'amen.